street sweep. Gay-2 stood in front of his mirror, struggling to perfect a Windsor knot. He pulled the thick end of his tie through the loop, but the knot unraveled in his hands. He tried again, and again he failed. Did he really need the tie? He guessed it would probably be easier to persuade the guards at the Sheraton to let him in with one, and even then. But he couldn't work out the steps, so Gay-2 put the necktie in his pocket and decided to try his luck without it. Sitting at the edge of his mattress, he waited for the hour to pass. He didn't want to arrive too early, too eager. His mattress was on the floor in the corner, and it was covered with all of his clothes, which earlier that evening he had tried on, considered, ruled out, reconsidered, tossed aside, before choosing a blue shirt stained under the arms, but he concealed the stain with his jacket, and black pants. Until that day, Gay-2 thought this was an adequate wardrobe, fairly nice for a street sweeper, but he had noticed even his best pants were worn at the hem, so he brought them to his mother. She was busy chopping onions, and her red hands and tearful eyes gave Gay-2 pause. He didn't want to add to her burden, but he needed her help. "Mama," he said, and she immediately responded later, and walked right past him to the garden to pick up some hot peppers. He thumbed the rebellious threads that seemed to be disintegrating in his fingers. "Please, Mama, the stitching is coming apart." She didn't look up from her vegetable garden, so he pressed on. "I need to look nice for Mr. Jeff's farewell party." "Ah, Mr. Jeff," she turned to face Gay-2 and would have thrown up her hands, except for the peppers resting on her lifted apron. "Again with Mr. Jeff," she groaned. "I have to see him. It's his last night in Addis Ababa, and he's been so good to me," Gay-2 explained, following his mother back to the kitchen. She called over her shoulder, "Has he been good to you? What has Mr. Jeff actually done for you?" Gay-2 hesitated, then said, "Mr. Jeff told me he has something for me." He'd have said more, but she was barely paying attention to him, focused on wiping off the peppers on her apron, splitting them in half, and taking out all the seeds. "Mama," he said, "I heard you, it's just... what is it you imagine he has for you?" Gay-2 didn't dare honestly answer that question, his mother's ridicule primed for the slightest provocation. Ever since Jeff Johnson invited him to the party, Gay-2 couldn't stop himself from guessing what the something might be. Over their months of friendship, Jeff Johnson had told Gay-2 how important Gay-2 was to him, how his organization could use a young man like Gay-2, and what a brilliant, keen head Gay-2 had on his shoulders. Gay-2's hopes had soared as he pictured the good job he'd surely be offered. In this moment, he nearly told his mother all about the new stable life he'd imagined, the freedom from worry that would come from the big paycheck he'd surely bring in, which would be so liberating now that the government seizure of land was creeping closer, neighborhood by neighborhood. Even the Tedloos had lost their home just a month ago, and they only lived 5 blocks away. But Gay-2 simply replied, "I just want to say goodbye to Mr. Jeff." "Gay-2, if this Mr. Jeff really wants you at his party, then he won't care what you wear." "But Mama, it's at the Sheraton," Gay-2 whispered. "At the Sheraton, did you say?" She turned and stared at him with raised eyebrows and a sorry look in her eyes. "It's at the Sheraton?" Her tone started high, then fell with Gay-2's spirits. "Do you really think this man wants you there at the Sheraton? He invited you to a party at the Sheraton? Only a man who has spent every day here having his shoes licked and every door flung open would be so unaware as to invite a boy like you to the Sheraton. To the Sheraton? Who is this Mr. Jeff?" Gay-2 didn't have the courage to reply, so she continued. "Let me tell you, he comes, is chauffeured to one international office after another, and at the end of the night, he goes to the fancy clubs on Bole Road, feasts, drinks, passes out, wakes up, then calls his chauffeur, who has slept lightly with his phone placed right by his head and with the ringer turned up high, so as not to miss a call from the likes of Mr. Jeff and disappoint the likes of Mr. Jeff. And then one day, this Mr. Jeff invites my boy to a party at the Sheraton. At the Sheraton? They'll never let you in, of course. The Sheraton? Oh, I could go on about this Mr. Jeff. Gaytu's mother had long formed her opinion about the Mr. Jeffs of the world. She had seen men and women like Jeff Johnson breeze through the country for decades, an old pattern. She'd kept her distance from the eager aid workers flown over for short stints with some big new NGO, this or that agency, such and such from who knows where. They appeared in her neighborhood, gave her surveys to fill out, and offered things she reluctantly accepted, vaccines and vitamins, things she quite happily pawned, English language books and warm clothing, and things at which she turned up her nose, genetically modified seeds and antimicrobial soap. Without fail, the Mr. Jeffs shaped, then reshaped her neighborhood in new ways, year in, year out. She compared them to the floods that washed out the roads in the south of the country each rainy season, carving new paths behind them, a cyclical force of change and recreation. Each September, after the rainy season ended and the new recruits from Western universities came to Ethiopia, she was known to have said, "And now let the storms begin."